The Walther family's gold built churches, hospitals, and schools, yet behind bricked windows, their own children vanished without graves. How could a legacy of faith be rooted in whispers of locked rooms and sealed prayers? Welcome to the Ghastly Journal, where the most disturbing truths lie hidden in plain sight, waiting for the bravier, the foolish to uncover them. Tonight, we open the rotted door to one of the strangest paradoxes in English history. A family praised from every pulpit, yet whispered about in every tavern. Their name was Walther. To speak it aloud in their native parish was to summon both gratitude and unease, for no other family in the region had donated so generously to the church, and yet none carried whispers so dark. The Walther Manor still stands on the outskirts of the moors, its stone bulk brooding against the restless sky. To the casual eye, it is a monument of charity. The stained glass windows of the nearby cathedral glisten with their name. The orphanage down the lane bears their crest, and every bell that rang on a Sunday morning carried the weight of their gold. The Walthers, it seemed, had given to God more than any family before them. And yet, for all their public piety, there was one part of their estate carefully avoided, even by their most loyal servants: the East Wing. Travelers described the manor as a house with a secret, a place where the western facade glowed with light from grand ballrooms and prayer halls, while the eastern side was sealed in silence. Windows were bricked over, doors barred from within, and ivy grew so thick across the stone that it seemed eager to erase what lay beneath. Locals crossed themselves when they passed by its looming shadow, whispering that behind those sealed walls the Walthers paid their truest tithe, one the church would never dare acknowledge. What makes this tale especially chilling is not the presence of death, for history is littered with tragedies, but the dissonance of holiness and horror. Imagine a family whose every public gesture was draped in righteousness, who funded schools, fed the poor, and gilded altars with coins that seemed heaven-sent, while within their own home their children were hidden away from the world, confined to the very wing that was said to moan with voices long after midnight. What secret could demand such a cruel balance, generosity at the altar and cruelty in the nursery? This is the story of the Walthers, a family that built churches with one hand and bricked their own blood into silence with the other. It is a tale carried through crumbling parish records, faded diaries, and the whispers of those who swore they saw pale faces staring from the cracks of the East Wing. As with all our investigations, we do not present this account to reassure, but to unsettle. For every saintly deed cast in the sunlight, there is often a shadow that stretches farther than we care to see. And in the case of the Walther family, that shadow stretches straight into the locked rooms of their manor, where hymns may have been sung but never heard. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 2 in the same style, building the Walther family's legacy of faith and laying the first hints of their deception? The Walther name first appears in town records in the year 1641, when Matthias Walther, a wealthy merchant with ties to the Baltic trade routes, purchased a tract of land that would become the family seat. From the very beginning, his presence was marked by acts of faith. Within a year of establishing himself, Matthias donated funds to repair the crumbling belfry of St. Helena's Church, commissioning a great bronze bell that still tolls over the valley on Sunday mornings. Inscribed upon its rim are the words, Soli Deo Gloria, to God alone the glory, and beneath it, in smaller letters, the Walther crest. That inscription was the first of many, for within decades their mark could be found on stone, wood, and glass throughout the region. As the generations passed, the Walthers became synonymous with philanthropy. The stained glass windows of St. Helena's gleamed with biblical scenes paid for in Walther coin. A hospital for the poor rose on the edge of town, its halls echoing with prayers of thanks for the family who had made it possible. When a devastating plague swept through the countryside in 1713, it was Walther gold that built the hospice that saved hundreds from dying in the streets. To the villagers, the Walthers were not simply landowners, they were benefactors touched by God's grace. Parish sermons praised their generosity, And it was said more than once that if sainthood could be bought by deeds alone, the Walthers had surely secured their place in heaven. But alongside the gilded hymns of gratitude ran a quieter melody of unease. For every bell they paid to cast, there were whispers that the sound was meant to drown out cries no one wished to acknowledge. For every pane of glass glowing with holy light, there were rumors of shadows gathering in the sealed east wing of the manor. And though the Walthers were always present in the front pews of the church, their children were seldom seen. Neighbors noted how rare it was to glimpse a Walther child in the streets or playing in the fields. When pressed, servants muttered that the young heirs were delicate or kept safe indoors. But these explanations never satisfied the lingering suspicion. The contradiction was difficult to ignore. Here was a family that gave freely to the world outside their walls, yet seemed to guard something with feverish secrecy within them. It was as though their public generosity was both shield and smokescreen, a way to purchase not just favor, but silence. Townsfolk who wondered too loudly about the absence of Walther children often found themselves recipients of sudden kindness and unexpected donation, a new roof for the church, a fresh well dug in the village square. Gratitude smothered questions, and in time the pattern became so familiar that few dared to ask at all. And so the legend of the Walther faith grew ever brighter in the public eye, even as the east wing of their manor darkened with secrets. Outwardly, they were the family that gave to every church. Inwardly, they were something else entirely, a truth whispered only in shadow, and never spoken aloud in daylight. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 3, next, focusing on the chilling architecture and sealed nature of the East Wing itself? The East Wing of Walther Manor has always stood apart, even from the rest of that brooding stone fortress. Visitors remark first on the imbalance. Where the western facade rises with grand windows and sweeping arches, the eastern side seems strangely mutilated, its windows bricked over as though the house itself were ashamed of what lay within. No sunlight filters through those walls, no firelight flickers behind the glass. Instead, ivy climbs in thick coils across the sealed stone, covering decades of mortar and repair, as if nature itself conspired to conceal what the Walthers once chose to bury. Architectural records preserved in county archives describe the East Wing as part of the original construction commissioned by Matthias Walther in 1645. Blueprints suggest it contained 3 floors of chambers, a separate chapel, and a narrow gallery overlooking the gardens. Yet by the middle of the 18th century, references to the wing vanish from household inventories. Later surveys omit it entirely, as though those rooms had never existed. Even so, the outline of its roof remains, the shadow of its windows visible in the irregular patches of stonework. Some observers claimed the wing was never bricked with skill, but with haystone stacked unevenly, as if the masons worked under great urgency, desperate to wall something away. Locals tell of strange locks fitted to its doors, not simple bolts but great iron bars that cross the frames like prison gates. The keys, they say, were held only by the master of the family, and passed from father to son in strict silence. Servants avoided even sweeping near those doors, claiming the handles grew cold to the touch even in midsummer. Children dared one another to creep up to the eastern walls, pressing their ears against the stone in hopes of hearing what might stir within. Some returned pale, swearing they heard faint sobs or the sound of something scratching softly from the other side. Others refused to speak of what they had heard at all. No one in the village ever dared to confront the Walthers directly. Their generosity was too great, their hold over the parish too firm. Instead, suspicions circulated in whispers, handed down from one generation to the next. Some claimed the family kept lunatics confined there, cousins or illegitimate children whose presence would tarnish their holy image. Others whispered of something darker, that the East Wing was not a place of confinement but of feeding, a secret chamber where the family gave their truest tithe. Whatever the truth, it was sealed away behind brick and iron, hidden in plain sight within the house that loomed over the valley. The East Wing remained untouched, a silent scar upon the manor's face, watching through bricked windows like sightless eyes. And though centuries passed, the villagers continued to cross themselves whenever they looked upon it, for they knew the Walthers were capable of great charity, but also of great concealment. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 4, next, where the first child's fate is revealed in parish records? The first concrete trace of the Walther family's darker legacy appears in the parish records of 1672, written in the careful hand of Father Elias Morton, vicar of St. Helena's. Amid the familiar entries of baptisms, marriages, and burials, one line stands out with an oddity that has troubled historians ever since. It reads simply, Anna Walther, child of Matthias and Helena Walther, gone to God, January 14th. No age is listed, no burial site is given, no witness signatures follow. Unlike every other death in the register, there is no record of a service, no tolling of the bell, no entry of a coffin lowered into the churchyard. The words, gone to God, are alone, and in them lingers the faint scent of secrecy. Anna Walther, if indeed she existed, seems never to have been seen by anyone outside the manor. No baptismal record bears her name, though her brothers had been christened in public ceremony. No neighbor recalls a child's laughter from the manor gardens, nor a small figure walking into town beside her mother. The absence is deafening. The only evidence of her life and of her death is that single line in the vicar's ledger. Yet whispers in the village tell another story. Some claimed that in the winter of 1671, a servant confided to her cousin that a child in the East Wing had grown sickly, wasting away in isolation. Others remembered the strange sound of a lullaby carried across the moors on cold nights, sung in a voice too high and fragile to belong to any of the family's grown daughters. When Anna's name appeared in the parish book the following January, it was less a surprise than a confirmation of suspicions that had already taken root. What troubled the townsfolk most was not only the lack of burial, but the lack of mourning. No bell rang from St. Helena's Tower. No funeral procession passed through the cobbled streets. The family, so lavish in its public faith, made no offering for the child's soul. Instead, in that same month, Matthias Walther commissioned an elaborate silver chalice for the altar, inscribed with verses of thanksgiving. To the villagers, it seemed almost as though the child's absence had been paid for, her memory exchanged for a gleaming vessel in which the priest raised the wine of communion. The silence surrounding Anna set a pattern that would repeat itself in years to come. For while the Walthers gave freely to the church, their own children vanished into the shadows of the East Wing, erased from memory except for cryptic notes in parish records. The first child found was not found at all, but hidden in plain sight, gone to God, as the vicar so carefully wrote, though perhaps not by any path the faithful would recognize. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 5, where the doctrine of silence begins to spread among the clergy, and the Walthers' gold ensures their secrets remain unspoken? Among the archives of St. Helena's Church, preserved in brittle parchment and ink faded to sepia, there exists a series of letters exchanged between parish priests and their superiors. At first glance, these letters concern ordinary matters: requests for repairs, instructions for feast days, inventories of candles and vestments. But hidden between these mundane lines are warnings, veiled in careful phrasing, that reveal how silence became the price of Walther generosity. By the year 1680, whispers of missing children had already begun to stir unease among the faithful. Parishioners asked why the Walther pews never held little faces, why the family's children were never baptized or seen at school. Priests who raised these questions found themselves quietly redirected by their bishops, urged to mind their duties and to show gratitude for the family's beneficence. One particularly telling letter, written in 1691 by Bishop Andrew Holcroft to Father Elias Morton, stands out. The bishop acknowledged rumors of unaccounted-for offspring within the household of Walther Manor, but concluded with chilling clarity, "You are not to burden yourself or your flock with idle speculation. The Lord provides where He will, and the Walthers provide generously for his house. Let that be sufficient. Soon after, church records note the installation of a grand new altarpiece, paid for in full by Matthias Walther. The timing is too precise to ignore. Each time a child disappeared into the silence of the East Wing, another gift appeared in the sanctuary: a carved lectern, a new set of hymnals, a costly renovation to the rectory. As decades passed, the pattern hardened into doctrine. Priests arriving fresh to the parish were quietly briefed that the Walthers were to be treated with reverence and never questioned about matters of family. The words, "do not inquire," appear repeatedly in the margin notes of surviving correspondence. Some clerics confessed unease in private diaries, admitting they suspected darker truths but feared the loss of patronage. Others seemed all too willing to accept that the salvation of the many new hospitals, orphanages, schools was worth the silence over the fate of a few unseen children. The villagers, of course, noticed the same coincidences. A missing child meant a new bell tolling from the tower. A shuttered window in the east wing was balanced by a gleaming cross above the altar. But when they brought their worries to their priests, they found no comfort. Instead, they were met with platitudes, prayers, and subtle warnings to guard their tongues. In time, the whole parish learned to keep quiet. The Walthers' gold bought not only stone and glass but also a doctrine of silence, a pact between church and benefactor that bound the holy to the unholy in a web of complicity. It was a silence that would stretch on for centuries, until the weight of too many vanished children could no longer be ignored. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 6, where a servant's testimony hints at what was truly happening behind the bricked windows of the East Wing? The first true glimpse behind the sealed facade of the East Wing did not come from priests or parish records, but from the frightened recollections of those who served within the manor. Among the few testimonies that survive, one stands out in particular: the confession of a maid named Margaret Holloway, recorded in 1738 during a brief inquest into the mysterious disappearance of another Walther child. Though the inquiry was quickly silenced and buried under the weight of the family's donations, Margaret's words remain preserved in a faded transcript, brittle with age. She told of long nights cleaning the great hall, where her broom would draw her near the East Wing's iron-banded doors. From the darkness beyond, she claimed, she often heard the faintest strains of singing not hymns, but lullabies. The voices were small, wavering, sometimes rising into a plaintive harmony, as though a group of children sought comfort in song. The unsettling detail, she insisted, was that the melodies never matched any tune she knew. They were not English, nor Latin, nor the familiar hymns of the parish, but strange, meandering strains that seemed to bend away from harmony, curling around the ear like smoke. One evening, Margaret described climbing the stairs to dust the portraits along the eastern corridor. There, half hidden beneath a mat of ivy, she noticed a narrow slit between the bricks where a window had once been. It was scarcely wide enough to admit a finger of light, yet when she looked closer, she saw the outline of a small face pressed against the crack. The eyes, she said, were enormous in the dimness, staring at her without expression. For a moment, she thought the child might call out, but instead the lips parted soundlessly, as though singing the same lullaby she had heard in the night. Startled, she fled, dropping her cloth, and when she returned with another servant, the slit was empty. The other girl dismissed it as fancy, but Margaret swore on her soul that she had seen one of the Walther children imprisoned in those rooms. Other servants whispered similar tales in secret, though few dared speak openly. Some claimed to hear scratching against the walls after midnight, like fingernails dragging across stone. Others confessed they avoided the eastern corridors entirely, for the air grew strangely cold there, and a sour smell of dampness lingered as though the stones themselves were rotting from within. Those who stayed long in the household learned quickly that questions about the East Wing carried consequences. Too much curiosity might see a servant dismissed overnight, their wages denied, their reputations quietly destroyed by the family's influence. And so the songs went unanswered. The pale faces glimpsed only in passing, and the locked rooms remained closed to all but the Walthers themselves. The children inside grew into whispers, shadows at the edge of torchlight, remembered only by those brave enough to admit what they had seen and heard. For the rest of the parish, the East Wing was an absence no one dared name, a silence drowned out by the tolling of Walther-funded bells. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 7, where the piety and price of the Walthers' bargain becomes clearer through the story of Father Bernard? In the winter of 1710, Father Bernard was newly installed at St. Father Bernard. Helena's, a young priest full of conviction and unafraid to speak truth, even when that truth threatened the wealthiest family in the parish. Unlike many of his predecessors who had learned quickly to avert their eyes from the Walthers' peculiar ways, Bernard was troubled by the questions that lingered on every villager's tongue, yet never made it into the pulpit. He asked openly why the family's children were so rarely seen. He wondered aloud why parish registers contained names without baptisms, deaths without burials. Most dangerously of all, he began to write letters to his bishop, demanding clarity, urging the church to investigate what he described as the contradiction of piety adorned and piety denied within one house. Those letters never reached their intended audience. Surviving fragments, preserved in private collections, suggest Bernard saw in the Walthers not saints but something more sinister, men and women whose generosity was a cloak to hide a cruelty festering inside their walls. "Gold buys silence," he wrote in one draft, "and silence has been purchased in this parish for generations. If we are to call ourselves shepherds, we cannot leave the children to wolves." His parishioners, inspired by his courage, whispered that perhaps this priest would be the one to break the chain of complicity that had bound St. Helena's to the manor for so long. But then, quite suddenly, Bernard's objections ceased. His surviving records end in February of that year, cut off mid-thought. Days later, a great oak organ arrived from London, an instrument of such splendor that the church had never seen its like. Paid for, naturally, by the Walthers, it became the pride of the parish. Choir boys sang their hymns to its thunderous chords, and the villagers marveled at the generosity that had delivered such a gift. Yet even as the music filled the nave, Bernard's own words were gone. His correspondence, once carefully archived, vanished without explanation. His journals, so recently filled with indignation, were removed from the rectory shelves. It was as though his brief flare of rebellion had been swallowed whole. Parish rumor suggested Bernard had been summoned to the manor one evening, called by Matthias Walther himself under the guise of confession. No one saw him enter, but several swore they saw him leave head bowed, lips pressed tight, as if every word he once dared speak had been stripped from him. From that night forward he never again mentioned the children. He spoke, instead of divine providence, of gratitude for gifts received, and of the blessings that flowed from the family whose wealth seemed inexhaustible. The villagers understood without being told. Bernard had been bought just as others before him. Whether through threat, persuasion, or something darker, the price of his silence was measured in polished wood and resounding pipes, in music that filled the church so completely, it seemed to push doubt itself into the shadows. The piety of the Walthers was beyond question, for they had paid dearly to keep it so. And the price, as always, was hidden in the East Wing, behind walls where no organ ever played. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 8, where the Walther matriarch's private letters reveal her torment over what was happening within the sealed rooms? Among the brittle documents that survive in the Walther family archive, none are more disturbing than the letters written by Anna Walther, wife of Matthias's grandson, in the year 1724. They were never intended for public eyes, composed in a looping, nervous hand, and addressed to her sister living in Bath. Yet somehow they escaped the fire that consumed much of the manor's records a century later, and what they reveal is not only the grief of a mother, but a terrible glimpse into the truth of the East Wing. Anna wrote first of loneliness. Though surrounded by servants and wealth, she confessed that she lived in a house where silence pressed on her more heavily than any company could relieve. She described walking the corridors at dusk and hearing faint voices drifting from behind the bricked windows, voices not entirely belonging to her children. In one letter she wrote, "They speak in tones too steady for play, answering to words I do not hear. My eldest says she is teaching a friend who comes through the wall, though she will not name him. When I beg her to stop, she grows frightened, as though the thing she addresses will be angered by my intrusion." Again and again, Anna circled back to her children's strange behavior. She claimed they would not sleep unless placed in the rooms of the East Wing, though she longed to move them closer to her. When she attempted it once, she found them screaming before dawn, their small bodies rigid, their mouths filled with whispers in languages she did not know. In another passage, she admitted that she had come to believe the wing itself held them in a kind of dreadful equilibrium, both prison and shield. "Better they be confined with it," she wrote of the presence in the walls, "than released to wander where all may see and suffer. The rooms contain not only them, but what follows them. If I open the doors, I open the house to the same fate." Her torment is palpable in every line. She grieved not only for the lives her children seemed never truly to live, but for the fate she sensed awaited them. One haunting entry tells of her youngest, who pressed her ear against the wall and murmured to the plaster as if soothed by a lullaby only she could hear. Anna's words tremble as she admits she sometimes thought of joining them in those locked chambers, if only to understand the nature of the friend in the stone who demanded their devotion. The letters end abruptly in December of that year. Family histories claim Anna took ill and died, though no physician's record survives. The correspondence leaves only her final, desperate thought: "I cannot tell if I am keeping them safe, or keeping the rest of us safe from them." In that chilling line, the paradox of the East Wing is laid bare, a place where the walls held not just children but secrets that grew louder with every generation. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 9, where rumors spread of the starving choir hidden inside those rooms? By the middle of the 18th century, the whispers surrounding the East Wing had taken on a life of their own, shaping themselves into a name that clung to the Walther family like mildew to stone. In taverns and at market stalls, villagers referred to the hidden children of the manor as the starving choir. It was not a name chosen lightly. Servants who left the household under strained circumstances carried with them stories that blurred the line between rumor and confession. They spoke of pale boys and girls clothed in the simplest white garments, garments that looked more like burial shrouds than the fine silks one might expect of a wealthy family. These children were rarely seen, and when they were, it was only in fleeting glimpses, faces staring through narrow cracks in the bricked windows, eyes wide, mouths moving in wordless harmony. The tales agreed on one point above all others: the children sang. Not playful songs or nursery rhymes, but hymns drilled into them from the moment they could speak. According to the servants, the Walther heirs were kept in near isolation, visited only by a tutor whose lessons consisted of scripture and chants. Their diets, too, were described as sparse, more fit for ascetics than for the sons and daughters of one of England's richest families. Thin broths, crusts of bread, and cups of watered wine sufficient to keep them alive, but never enough to fill out their fragile forms. Those who saw them whispered that they looked less like children than like spirits, their voices too frail and too steady, blending into eerie chords that slipped through the stones. On certain nights, when the wind carried just so across the moors, townsfolk claimed to hear those voices outside the manor walls. High-pitched, mournful strains floated from the bricked windows, a harmony both beautiful and terrible. Some swore the voices were accompanied by faint sobs, as though the hymns were sung not in worship but in desperation. Mothers drew their children closer when the sound reached their ears, for it carried the unmistakable timbre of hunger, the cry of young bodies denied the warmth and freedom of life beyond their prison. The name starving choir spread quietly, passed from mouth to mouth, though few dared speak it within earshot of a priest. For every time such whispers grew too bold, a new Walther donation appeared at the church, gilding the altar or filling the poorhouse coffers. Gratitude weighed heavier than suspicion, and so the hymns went unanswered. But in the minds of the villagers, the image endured. Children clad in white, pale and hollow-eyed, their voices raised not to heaven but into the dark, stone-bound air of the East Wing. They were a choir no one saw, a choir meant never to be heard, singing their hunger into eternity. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 10, where villagers claim to witness the midnight procession of ghostly figures in the manor's windows? It was said that on certain holy days, when the bells of St. Helena's had long ceased their ringing, and the village lay wrapped in uneasy sleep, the manor itself would wake. Midnight was the hour, when shadows lengthened across the moors, and the wind carried a sharper chill. Those who lived closest to Walther Manor swore that on these nights, always tied to feast days or vigils in the church calendar, the east wing flickered to life. Behind its bricked windows, light would seep faintly through cracks in the mortar, and in that light shapes could be seen, thin, elongated figures moving in solemn procession. There were always 7 of them. Not 6, not 8, but 7 pale children drifting past the sealed windows in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Their heads were bowed as though in prayer, their arms clasped together or raised in gestures that mimicked ancient rites. And though the thick walls muffled all ordinary sound, the villagers claimed they could hear a chant carried through the night air. The words were never clear, never discernible as Latin or English, yet the tones struck deep into the listener's chest. Some likened it to a funeral hymn, others to the wailing of orphans, but all agreed the cadence was wrong for children, too steady, too mournful. The sound crept beneath doors and lingered in ears until dawn. Parents warned their own little ones not to look too long at the east wing when these nights came, for more than one child had been found shivering in bed afterward, claiming the pale figures had turned their faces toward them. Stories passed through generations of villagers who saw not just shadows but faces, thin and hollow, with eyes that caught the moonlight like pools of water. These eyes seemed ancient, far older than the fragile bodies that carried them, and once seen, they could never be forgotten. The phenomenon became part of local folklore. The midnight procession was spoken of in hushed tones, a reminder that the Walthers' piety had purchased something darker than sanctity. Some believed the 7 children were not living at all, but spirits bound to replay their grim ritual endlessly. Others argued they were the current heirs, compelled by some family rite to march and sing until their voices wore thin. Whatever the truth, those who witnessed it felt the same sensation, a tightening in the chest, a sense of being watched by something that wanted acknowledgement, if not participation. And still the villagers said nothing. To question the Walthers was to invite ruin, and so the procession passed, year after year, unseen by the world but never forgotten by those who dared look out across the moors at midnight. 7 figures. 7 voices, a hymn without words, sung to something only they could see. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 11, where evidence emerges that each Walther donation to the church coincided with these disappearances and rituals? The illusion of sanctity that surrounded the Walthers did not persist by faith alone. Hidden within the dust of church ledgers and the brittle pages of diocesan records lies evidence that the family's gold flowed in deliberate rhythms, timed not with harvests or feast days, but with the quiet disappearances of their children. Whenever a Walther child was rumored to have vanished into the East Wing, an entry of donation appeared within weeks, sometimes days, documenting a sum so generous that no parish priest could afford to question its origin. One ledger from 1,748 records, an unusually large stipend marked only as gift of consolation. The very same year, villagers whispered that a young boy, the heir to the Walther line, had not been seen since spring. No burial was recorded. No toll of the bell announced his passing. Instead, the parish gained a set of new candlesticks for the altar, their bases etched with the Walther crest. Another entry, dated 1763, lists an endowment large enough to commission the restoration of the bishop's residence. This donation coincides exactly with the disappearance of twin girls born to the manor, whose presence had been rumored but never publicly confirmed. Parishioners spoke in low voices of two small faces glimpsed in an upper window, pale and pressed against the glass, never to be seen again after midsummer. Over time, the pattern became unmistakable. Each silence in the family register was balanced by a hymn book, a cross, a new chapel built on the edge of town. The church flourished, its walls bright with Walther gifts, while its shepherds turned their gaze from the shadows that clung to the east wing. Priests who had once shown unease were replaced, quietly reassigned to distant parishes. Those who remained grew practiced at delivering sermons extolling the family's generosity, their words thick with gratitude, their eyes clouded with something closer to resignation. The deeper the church was bound to the Walthers, the quieter the parish became. Villagers who brought their suspicions to the rectory found themselves subtly chastised, reminded that gossip was a sin, that gratitude should outweigh idle curiosity. The organ thundered with Walther-funded hymns, drowning out the faint sound of children's voices that some swore still carried across the moors at night. Slowly, the people learned that their salvation, at least in earthly terms, depended on silence. And so the pact endured. Children gone without graves, priests enriched without questions, and a church gilded in offerings paid for with shadows. It was a sanctuary built not only on stone and scripture, but on the price of every Walther child who vanished behind those bricked windows. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 12, where the East Wing is briefly exposed during a fire in 1793, revealing horrors no donation could conceal? The year 1793 brought with it the only moment in which the East Wing of Walther Manor was forced to reveal its secrets, though the revelation was fleeting and soon smothered beneath layers of wealth and influence. A fire began in the kitchens late one summer night, sparked, according to the official report, by a careless scullery boy who left embers smoldering in the stove. The flames spread swiftly through the eastern corridors, climbing tapestries and licking at timber beams until the manor itself seemed poised to collapse. Townsfolk rushed across the moors to watch, their faces lit orange by the inferno. For the first time in living memory, the locked doors of the East Wing were breached not by curious villagers, nor by prying clergy, but by desperate firemen trying to save what they could. What they found inside was spoken of only in whispers, and even then, only for a short while before the story was suppressed. Several men later confessed that when they smashed through the sealed doors, they entered chambers heavy with soot and silence, rooms that had clearly not seen daylight in decades. There, in blackened beds that had been chained to the floor, lay skeletal remains-small frames curled unnaturally, bones brittle and pale even in the glow of flame. Some still bore shackles at their wrists and ankles, iron rusted through but unmistakable. The sight was so ghastly that hardened men dropped their tools and crossed themselves, refusing to set foot further into the room. One fireman, who fled the parish the following year, swore that he saw not just bones but tufts of linen clinging to them, scraps of white garments like choir robes, singed but still recognizable. Another told of toys strewn in the ash, a wooden horse, a doll missing its face, all charred by heat, yet strangely arranged, as though set carefully at the sides of the beds. The implication was clear. These were not forgotten graves, nor accident victims. These were children confined, left to perish in silence behind bricked walls, while their family prayed in gilded chapels. But the truth was never permitted to spread far. Within days, the ruins of the East Wing were sealed off again, the rubble carted away under the watchful eyes of both the Walthers and local officials who had been hastily summoned. The skeletal remains were never recorded in official documents, though the villagers remembered well the pale faces of firemen stumbling from the manor that night, retching into the dirt. In their place, a new report was issued claiming that the wing had been empty, long disused, containing nothing of value. Donations soon followed. Funds to rebuild the church roof, to establish a schoolhouse, to ensure the town's gratitude would drown its unease. By autumn, the manor stood whole once more, the east wing reconstructed and sealed tighter than before. The fire was reduced in memory to little more than a dramatic tale of survival, its darker revelations erased by gold and silence. Yet those who had seen the skeletal forms never forgot. In taverns, behind closed doors, they whispered that for one brief night the truth had clawed its way into the open, only to be buried again beneath brick, iron, and the endless charity of a family whose piety was built on bones. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 13, where the account of the lone escapee in 1831 brings the starving choir's reality into the open for the first time? The year 1831 gave rise to a story that has never been fully forgotten in the town's dark collective memory. On a fog-choked autumn morning, a figure appeared at the edge of the village, square-thin, ragged, barefoot. Witnesses described her as no older than 10, though her eyes were the hollow eyes of someone who had known far too many winters. Her hair was matted, her skin pale to the point of near translucence, and her white gown was tattered, smeared with soot and blood. The girl collapsed by the well, whispering words that no one at first could comprehend. When they leaned close, she gasped in a strained, tuneless voice about shadows that eat songs, and how the children in the East Wing had sung themselves hoarse, hoping to keep those shadows at bay. What startled the villagers most was not only the horror of her claim, but the certainty that she had come from the manor itself. They had seen her face pressed against the narrow bricked windows over the years, they insisted, though most had convinced themselves it was nothing more than imagination. Now she stood before them, living proof of what lay behind those sealed walls. She tried to explain more, speaking in bursts of phrases, chains on the beds, the hymn that never ends, a mother who wept behind the doors. But her words dissolved into sobs and half-sung fragments of a lullaby that chilled those who heard it. The villagers gathered, torn between fear and pity. Some urged that the priest be called, but when Father Moritz arrived, his expression turned grave, almost practiced, as though he had anticipated this moment. He placed a cloak around the girl's shoulders, muttered a prayer, and instructed the people to return to their homes. Yet the child resisted, clutching the cobblestones and screaming that she would not go back, that the walls were hungry and the shadows waited. Her cries were so piercing that shutters were drawn and doors bolted, for none could bear the sound. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Witnesses claimed she broke free from Father Moritz's grip and darted into the woods at the town's edge, moving with a strength that belied her wasted form. Some swore she was pursued by figures cloaked in the mist. Others dismissed this as fear playing tricks. Search parties were sent out in the days that followed, but no trace of her was ever found. No body, no footprints, nothing but scraps of torn fabric caught on the thorns of blackthorn bushes, fluttering like pale ghosts in the wind. The disappearance was quietly folded into silence. The priest announced from the pulpit that the girl had been taken into God's mercy, and that the faithful should not pry into what God intended to keep hidden. Soon after, the church received its largest single donation from the Walthers, a towering gilded crucifix placed above the altar, shining down on the parish like a watchful sentinel. But in tavern whispers and among the old families of the town, the tale endured. They called her the lost angel of the East Wing, the one child who had dared to step beyond the bricked walls. And though she vanished as mysteriously as she came, her brief appearance tore a fissure in the silence that gold had long enforced, leaving the villagers with a haunting certainty that behind the facade of piety, the Walthers were guarding horrors that no hymn could ever absolve. Would you like me to carry on with Chapter 14, Shadows in the Ledger, where the discovery of strange bookkeeping notes ties donations directly to missing children? In the year 1854, the ground beneath Walther Manor was opened for the first time in centuries. A team of laborers had been called to repair the crumbling foundation of the East Wing, the part of the estate long sealed from curious eyes. The men worked by lantern light, hacking through layers of stone and earth until their picks struck something unexpected. Not mere rock, but smooth, deliberate carvings that stretched across slabs buried deep below. At first, they thought them the idle scratchings of masons, but when the soil was brushed away, the images emerged, and with them, a silence fell upon the workers. Etched in the stone were figures of children, their small bodies bent at the knee, heads bowed in reverence toward a towering form. The figure had no face, no eyes, no mouth, only a smooth, featureless void framed in blackened lines. In some depictions, the children's hands were clasped in prayer. In others, their arms were outstretched as if offering themselves. The precision of the carvings unsettled the men, for these were not crude doodles of folklore but intentional symbols, each one engraved with a hand that understood both artistry and ritual. Among the workers was an older mason, Heinrich Gruber, who had studied scraps of pagan lore in his youth. He recognized elements older than Christianity itself, funless symbols, spirals, and sigils that had once marked rites of supplication. His voice trembled when he muttered that this was no Christian foundation but something older, something that had demanded obedience long before the church bells ever rang in the town. The others laughed uneasily, yet none could shake the feeling that they had uncovered something meant never to be seen again. That night, several of the workers refused to return. The foreman reported strange happenings: tools gone missing, lanterns extinguishing as if by invisible breath, faint sounds beneath the stone, like whispers rising from deep caverns. Those who pressed on swore they heard singing high, reedy voices echoing from nowhere, singing a wordless chant that matched the posture of the kneeling children in the carvings. Work halted altogether when one man was found unconscious by the pit, his hand pressed flat against the carved figure of the faceless being, his lips murmuring fragments of hymns he had never learned. The Walthers responded swiftly. Within days, the site was sealed. A priest was summoned, but his blessing was short, nervous, and oddly perfunctory. Gold exchanged hands, and the records of the discovery were quietly erased. New stones were laid over the carvings, burying the faceless figure once again in silence. Yet the laborers did not forget. In hushed tones at taverns, they whispered of what they had seen, calling it the Black Witness, the figure before whom the Walther children were said to kneel. And though the family dismissed the tales as drunken gossip, the villagers began to notice something peculiar. The east wing grew colder with each passing year, as though the faceless figure still lingered beneath. Patient, waiting, and hungry for prayers it had not yet finished consuming. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 15, the Black Veil Sermons, where clergy began echoing strange doctrines in their preaching, as though influenced by the Walthers' hidden faith? It began subtly, in the small wooden pews of the parish, when the Walther family sat in their grand seats closest to the altar. Parishioners whispered of a strange undercurrent during Mass, a sound too delicate to name at first. It was not the shuffle of shoes or the creak of wood, but a faint, airy chorus, like children breathing secrets into the air. The faithful leaned forward, straining to hear the words of the priest, yet beneath every sermon delivered during Walther-funded services there lingered a murmur, weaving like invisible threads through the sacred space. Some swore it was the rustle of angels, though the longer one listened, the less heavenly it seemed. The voices were soft, high, and childlike, never clear enough to form words, but always there humming, whispering, swelling in moments of silence. It was said that the sound grew loudest during prayers for the dead, as if unseen lips echoed the invocations, repeating them in a language that twisted familiar syllables into something unholy. An old widow described it as a choir that did not sing for God but sang through him, as though each blessing was doubled, each scripture warped by voices hidden just behind the veil of the human ear. Those who dared to turn their heads toward the Walthers noticed odd details. The matriarch would sit very still, her eyes downcast, lips pressed tightly together, as if restraining herself from betraying knowledge of what the whispers meant. Children seated near the family sometimes cried, tugging at their mother's sleeves, insisting that The singing children were behind the altar. Mothers hushed them, afraid of drawing the wrong kind of attention, but the unease lingered. And always, after such disturbances, a generous donation would arrive from the Walthers, enough to soothe clergy doubts and keep parishioners cautious in their gossip. Father Joseph, who served in the mid-1700s, once attempted to address the matter openly, pausing mid-sermon when the whispers rose like a tide. He demanded silence, rebuking what he called the profane interruption of spirits. Yet instead of ceasing, the whispers swelled into a wave, rising over his voice until he faltered and fell back. Witnesses said his candle extinguished itself on the altar, though no draught touched it. Within the week, a new stained glass window arrived, funded by the Walthers, and Father Joseph never again spoke of the phenomenon. The whispers continued for generations, always tied to services tied by Walther gold. Some parishioners began to dread their donations, for they knew that every new bell, every golden chalice, every hymn book paid for by the family carried with it a price, the return of that childlike murmur, as if the hidden children of the East Wing lent their voices to the service, not in worship, but in warning. Would you like me to move next into Chapter 16, The Harvest Feast, 1889? Where villagers claimed food from Walther celebrations tasted of ash and left children fevered. The turn of the century brought with it a brief stir of courage, or perhaps desperation, when Father Thomas Radin took the pulpit and did what no priest before him had dared. On a Sunday morning in 1899, with the Walther family seated prominently at the front of the congregation, he abandoned his prepared sermon and spoke instead of wrought. His voice, usually gentle, rang out with a fervor that startled even the most pious. He declared that faith had been bought and strangled, that donations draped in gold were no substitute for truth, and that there was blood buried beneath the foundations of the church itself. He named the Walthers directly, accusing them of bribery, of silencing questions, of raising monuments to God while burying his children in shadow. Gasps rippled through the pews, a few parishioners clutching their rosaries, others glancing nervously at the family whose name had become nearly synonymous with divine favor. The Walther patriarch, old and stern, did not rise in anger. He simply sat motionless, his hands folded on his cane, lips pressed into a thin line. Anna Walther, her lace veil shadowing her eyes, bowed her head as if in prayer, though some whispered she smiled faintly. Father Radin finished his denunciation with shaking hands, sweat dripping down his brow, declaring that no more Walther gold would be accepted so long as he lived. He lived only 3 weeks more. On a cold morning, the parish doors were found wide open, though the lock showed no sign of breakage. Parishioners who entered stumbled upon a sight so grotesque that several fainted where they stood. Father Radin lay before the altar, his arms outstretched in mock crucifixion, his face pale and twisted in agony. His mouth had been forced open, stuffed full of torn hymn book pages, crammed so deep that the parchment bulged against his cheeks. Some claimed the ink had run from the pages as though they had been soaked in tears. His body bore no wounds, no sign of struggle, yet his tongue was swollen black as if strangled by the very words of Scripture. The authorities arrived swiftly, but worked even more swiftly to close the matter. They declared it a tragic madness, a priest overcome by guilt or zeal who had inflicted this end upon himself. But whispers spread faster than any official proclamation. Many believed the Walthers had orchestrated the scene, turning his own holy tools against him as a warning to others. No further priest, in the decades that followed, dared to question the family openly. Walther donations flowed once more, unchallenged, gilding the church with silence. From that day, parishioners entered the church with lowered eyes, murmuring prayers not just to God, but to whatever shadows might be listening. It was said that even long after, when a hymn book was opened, some pages bore faint stains of red, as though Father Radin's defiance had left a mark the Walthers could never scrub away. Do you want me to continue with Chapter 17, The Harvest Feast? 1905, where villagers claimed Walther feasts carried a curse? The First Great War arrived like a storm across Europe, and even the quiet town that huddled around the Walther estate was shaken by its fury. Soldiers marched through its streets, ration lines stretched down muddy roads, and the thunder of artillery carried faintly on the wind. Yet even in those years of chaos, when death became an ordinary companion, the townsfolk whispered of something more dreadful than the front lines. The east wing of the manor remained sealed, its bricked windows staring blankly across the valley, and from within, the voices of children continued. They sang not with the rhythm of hymns, nor with the comfort of prayer, but with drawn-out laments that slipped beneath the sounds of falling bombs and shattering glass. When the air raid sirens wailed, neighbors often rushed to their cellars, trembling as the ground shook. But as the sirens' mechanical cries faded, another chorus rose to fill the silence. Survivors of those nights swore the voices were louder than the destruction itself, threading through the air like ghostly needles. Some said they drowned out the firestorms, others that the children's chants carried on even after the town church bell was silenced by a shell. A few, daring or perhaps foolish, ventured closer to the manor in those blacked-out hours and reported seeing faint glimmers in the bricked windows, soft white shapes pressed against the stone, as if trying to push through. When the Second War swept across the continent, the same dread returned, sharpened by hunger and loss. German troops moved into the region, seizing homes and fields, yet they never occupied the Walther manor. Even the most hardened officers kept their distance, muttering about noises that unsettled their men. One soldier, half drunk, boasted he would pry open the east wing to see what secrets it hid. His unit reported him missing the next dawn, though his boots were found neatly arranged by the manor gate, the laces tied into a knot resembling rosary beads. No investigation followed. War had a way of swallowing questions whole. Neighbors claimed that during the heaviest bombings, when whole blocks crumbled and the horizon glowed red, the choir in the East Wing reached a terrible crescendo. The voices rose in layers, shrill and overlapping, until it seemed the air itself quivered with their grief. Some described it as children pleading for mercy, others as chants of a language no one could understand. The strangest accounts told of moments when the bombs stopped, the sirens stilled, and only the East Wing sang on, as if untouched by the chaos outside. And so, through two wars that claimed millions of lives, the Walther tradition endured, unbroken, indifferent to the collapse of empires. Long after the smoke cleared and memorials were erected for the dead, the people of the valley remembered not the thunder of battle, but the voices that would not be silenced. In their memory, the wars were not defined by generals or treaties, but by the uncanny persistence of a choir that outlived even fire and steel. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 18, The Final Benefaction, where the last of the Walthers attempt to seal their legacy with one final donation? By 1960, the once sprawling Walther line had thinned to a single fragile thread. The manor still stood in its brooding silence above the town, its walls blackened by weather and time, its gardens reduced to patches of tangled ivy and stubborn thorns. The last heir, Heinrich Walther, moved about like a ghost within its halls, glimpsed only rarely by outsiders. He was said to be a man of stern bearing, pale as parchment, his eyes ringed in shadows from sleepless nights. Officially, he had no wife, no children, and no hope of continuing the family name. Yet whispers wound their way through the taverns and markets, suggesting that the old traditions of the East Wing had not died with his forebears. Though the town had grown more modern, with electric lamps glowing where once only candles burned, the manor resisted the touch of progress. The East Wing remained sealed, its windows bricked and black, its doors chained shut as they had been for generations. But in that decade, villagers began to murmur of unsettling sights. On moonless nights, they said, pale faces would flicker in the seams of mortar, like light straining to escape from behind stone. Some swore they saw the outline of a child's hand pressed faintly against the bricked glass, fingers splayed wide, vanishing when the eye tried to focus. Old farmers who had lived their whole lives in the valley whispered that Heinrich could be heard walking the halls long after midnight, his steps followed by the faint patter of lighter feet. The grocer's wife spoke of hearing lullabies carried faintly on the wind, half tunes with no words, rising and falling as though sung by children who did not know they were being listened to. Even the parish priest, a man cautious with superstition, admitted in confidence that he sometimes heard echoes from the manor during evening prayers, as though a second service were being conducted in some hidden chamber. Heinrich himself seemed unbothered by the gossip. He continued to donate to the church, the hospital, and the town library, his wealth ensuring that official scrutiny never lingered too long on his affairs. Yet the more money flowed outward, the more the townsfolk whispered about what was being concealed within. By then, the older generation remembered too well the stories of the starving choir, the survivor's tale, the skeletal remains unearthed during the fire. The past had not been buried, it lingered, refusing to loosen its grip. When Heinrich died suddenly in 1962, the official records declared him the last of his name, the end of the Walther bloodline. Yet the night his body was carried down into the town, several witnesses swore the manor's bricked windows flickered with pale, watchful faces. 7 of them, arranged in a row, each pair of eyes following the procession until the coffin was out of sight. None spoke of it aloud in daylight, but the memory gnawed at them for years afterward. The East Wing, it seemed, was not yet finished with its watchers. The year 2003 was supposed to mark a renewal of the old Walther estate. A consortium had purchased the manor with plans of converting it into a luxury hotel, trading on its Gothic mystique to draw curious tourists. For decades, the East Wing had remained untouched, avoided by caretakers, and shunned by architects too superstitious to probe its depths. But progress demanded walls be torn down, floors lifted, and the past made pliable to modern ambitions. The first weeks went smoothly, until a crew began stripping away plaster from a portion of the East Wing long thought to be structurally unsound. Behind the layers of brick and timber, they found iron bolts driven deep into the stone, sealing something more than just emptiness. When the chamber was breached, the workers stumbled into air that had not stirred in centuries. It carried a sweetness turned rancid, the residue of decay too old to be fresh, but too persistent to have fully fled. Their lanterns cast weak halos on the chamber's contents, and several of the men turned pale at once. Within, arranged with a grotesque deliberation, lay the skeletal remains of children. There were dozens of them, their bones small, their forms fragile, yet their posture impossibly deliberate. They had been placed in a circle, each skeleton kneeling, heads bowed as though locked in endless prayer. Some had their tiny hands folded at the chest, others outstretched toward the center of the ring. Most horrific of all was what the workers discovered upon closer inspection. Each skull had been forced open, jaws wrenched wide as if silenced screams had been frozen in bone. Wooden dowels, long rotted to splinters, had been inserted to keep the mouths gaping, as though their voices were meant to be permanently fixed in some grotesque hymn. The imagery was too precise to be mistaken for mere collapse or accident. It was a ritual arrangement, a tableau crafted with intent. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the crew, though the developers worked furiously to contain it. Yet even as they tried, strange things began to trouble the site. Tools misplaced themselves, though no one admitted to touching them. A soft murmur would pass through the halls at dusk, like voices whispering in unison just out of earshot. One worker swore that as he stood near the chamber's edge, he heard a child's voice hum a tune with no words, rising from the circle of bones. He never returned to the site after that night. The bones were swiftly removed under the cover of darkness, no records filed, no coroner summoned. Officials who might have spoken were bribed or silenced, the same pattern repeating as it had for centuries. The chamber was resealed within days, plastered over as though it had never been opened. Yet for those who had seen the remains with their own eyes, the image could never be erased. Dozens of children, mouths pried into eternal song, waiting in silence beneath the east wing. The workers whispered among themselves that it had not been a discovery at all, but an interruption, as if they had stepped into a prayer that had never ended. The tale of the Walthers, traced through centuries of whispers, records, and silences, reveals a pattern that was never merely domestic tragedy. It was not simply a family cursed by secrecy, nor even an eccentricity of wealth and madness. The truth lay in the debts they paid and the debts they created, a rhythm of exchange that laced together church and manor in an unholy covenant. Every time a Walther child disappeared, the parish grew richer. A new organ here, a gilded chalice there, fresh stonework in the nave, and stipends for priests who asked no questions. The church thrived, even as coffins without bodies were lowered into consecrated earth. It was as though each child gone into the east wing became, in turn, another coin struck for God, or at least for the institution that bore his name. But beneath the prayers and bells, the echo was unmistakable, the sound of silence bought and sold. The bargain was never written, never confessed outright, but all who lived near the manor seemed to understand its weight. Donations poured into holy coffers not from devotion, but from fear. Priests blessed what should never have been blessed, whispered absolutions over sins too monstrous to redeem, and looked away from the sealed windows where pale faces pressed against the glass. The cross above the church grew brighter with each gift, but the faith that lit it was rotten. The price of piety was not measured in coins, but in the hunger of whatever lingered in the east wing. For the question that haunts the story is this: what did the Walthers believe they were worshipping? The hymns sung by children in white were not sung for the God of mercy, nor for Christ who embraced the innocent. The carvings unearthed beneath the manor told of something older, a faceless figure seated upon shadow, its supplicants bent in unending genuflection. The lullabies that bled through the walls, the whispers that curled under the priest's sermons, the voices louder than bombsit, all suggested that worship was being fed not upward toward heaven, but downward, into the earth. Something older than any creed had been courted, and the Walthers paid for its favor with their own flesh and blood. So the story does not close with salvation, nor with the triumph of faith over darkness. It ends in a question that corrodes the marrow of belief itself. If the cross that towered over the parish was built on the silence of priests and the lives of children, then perhaps the light that shone from it was no light at all. Perhaps it was the glimmer of a debt too great ever to be repaid. Not all offerings are laid upon altars of stone. Some are laid upon the small, cold bodies of children, their hymns swallowed by the shadows.